and start the lecture, I'll invite Vice Chancellor Professor Najma Akhtar to please start the welcome address, to give her words of welcome to all who joined. Professor Najma.
Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the first initial an opportunity to welcome the eminent guests who are here. Respected Professor Sugata Bose, Gardiner Professor of History, Harvard University. Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Emeritus, Center for Political Studies, JNU. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Emeritus, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. Professor Asaduddin, Dean Faculty of Humanities and Languages at Jamia Millia Islamia. Professor Rumki Basu from Jamia Millia Islamia itself, and Jamia fraternity members, distinguished guests from India and abroad, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a very good evening and I'm so happy to see you all. On behalf of Jamia Millia Islamia and Mushirul Hasan Endowment, I welcome you all to the inaugural Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lecture. Due to the ongoing pandemic, we are unable to host any of our public lectures on our beautiful campus, and therefore we are hosting this lecture online. As you all know, it is Jamia's centenary year and Mahatma Gandhi's 150th birth anniversary we are celebrating, and we are celebrating all these events in our Jamia calendar with equal fervor and enthusiasm, in spite of Corona. Jamia, whose association with Mahatma Gandhi is well known and well recorded, and has come a long way and established itself as a prominent central university today. I'm happy to make a mention here that Jamia Millia Islamia made a spectacular performance in the NIRF ranking, where it figured among the top 10 universities of the country. It has happened for the first time in the history, and it's the right time also because this is our centenary year, and so it's right time to celebrate the achievements for this. The reason for getting this, I feel, is because of its teacher, researchers, students' profound interest in their classroom transactions, meticulous researchers, vigilant studies, and so on. Today we come together for a special reason, special opportunity that has been given to us by Professor Zoya Hassan. On the request of Professor Zoya Hassan, the wife of late Mushirul Hasan, Professor Mushirul Hasan, Jamia Millia Islamia has established a Mushirul Hasan Endowment as a mark of respect for Professor Mushirul Hasan's devotion and commitment to Jamia Millia Islamia, and a long commitment to Jamia Millia Islamia. Professor Zoya Hassan has very generously donated rupees 1.5 crore towards this endowment. Mushirul Hasan Endowment will be used for postdoctoral fellowship and 2 postgraduate merit cum means Mushirul Hasan scholarships. Jamia will also hold annual Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lectures on themes related to contemporary history, society, politics, and so on. Mushirul Hasan Endowment will surely inspire Jamia alumni, its professors, its non-teaching staff members, and alumni to make such endowments for the benefit of students and for education. This is the beginning, actually. Since Jamia is closely associated with quality and futuristic education and NEP 2020, it seems pertinent to mention here that the recently announced new education policy is a welcome step in the right direction,
Yes, sir, actually.
with a desired focus on critical thinking, experiential learning, integrated
Actually,
pedagogy. आवाज नहीं आ रही है? सबको आवाज आ रही है मेरी?
जी मैम, you are audible.
Audible, no? And inclusive digital education. The new education policy holds promises to ensure exponential educational, social, political, and economic growth. Deeply rooted in our values, it will promote the national integration and motivate the individuals for continuous pursuit of harmonious and progressive development. I am happy today to inaugurate the first Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lecture. Hasan has joined the Department of History and Culture at Jamia Millia Islamia as one of the youngest professors and rose to become its Vice Chancellor, a position he served from 2004 to 2009. As a Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia, he contributed his share towards the growth and development of Jamia with a sincere attempt to transform it in a significant way, not only by opening new centers of research and teaching, but also by making it a hub for scholars. Of his efforts to open the university to the world made Jamia known as a modern institution. This inaugural memorial lecture is the tribute of Jamia academic community to Professor Mushirul Hasan, a committed scholar and a dedicated administrator. We remember him with love and respect. I'm deeply grateful today to Professor Sugata Bose, Gardiner Professor of History, Harvard University, that he readily agreed to deliver this inaugural lecture, although it's very odd time for a person sitting away from India to deliver a lecture. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Sugata Bose. Welcome to India and welcome to Jamia. Also welcome Professor Zoya Hasan and Professor Prabhat Patnaik as a part of our distinguished audience and speakers. I also welcome students and teachers of Jamia Millia and all others from and abroad who have joined to listen to Professor Sugata Bose today and be part of this ceremony. I will request Professor Rumki Basu to take this program ahead. And before that, I thank you all. Thank you very, very much for joining today in remembering Professor Mushirul Hasan together with us. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for setting the tone and tenor of the memorial lecture today. Let me announce at the outset once again that we in the organizing committee have been quite overwhelmed by the unprecedented response to the lecture ever since it was announced. We are happy and elated, and I can only thank Madam Najma to have taken the decision to host it in Jamia's centenary year. I now invite Dr. Zoya Hasan, Professor Emerita, Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to tell us about the mandate and objectives of the recently created Mushirul Hasan Endowment to honor the memory of Professor Mushirul Hasan. Dr. Zoya Hasan, please.
Vice Chancellor Professor Najma Akhtar, Professor Sugata Bose, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Mohammad Asaduddin, Professor Rumki Basu, colleagues and friends. Mushir was a well-known historian. As a historian, his forte was modern Indian history and the modern history of India's Muslims. His major works on Indian nationalism, partition, intellectual history, and the ramifications and diversities of Muslim identity and politics in the subcontinent were produced during his long association with the Jamia Millia. Mushir was a wonderful academic, but he was also an effective and successful institution builder. Both these qualities were clearly manifest during his association with this university and as the Director General of the National Archives of India. both jobs were much to his taste and he relished doing both of them. Mushi devoted the major part of his academic and institutional life to Jamia Millia, which he served as Pro-Vice Chancellor and eventually as Vice Chancellor. His cosmopolitan, liberal, and secular views found expression in the many actions and new academic initiatives he started. For all his acute intellect and vast corpus of work as a historian, Mushi remained strongly committed to Jamia Millia, and recasting this institution had become his chief focus. As Vice Chancellor, he rebuilt and reinvigorated the institution, which was fast becoming one of the country's foremost institutions of higher learning. Extending Jamia Millia's range through opening new faculties, overhauling its buildings and ambience, he changed its profile profoundly. Joint programs with other institutions became a norm. Jamia's great expansion occurred within a stunning 5-year period when the university became Delhi's happening place, thus catapulting it to a new future. And as Mushi sought to make institutional change fitting to a national purpose, he was keenly aware of Jamia's distinctive identity, having written a history of the institution from the moment of its founding. Thus, Mushi remained loyal to Jamia's moorings. By the end of his term, it was a university greatly refurbished, but remaining firmly rooted in its distinctive identity and history. A liberal secular historian by training, Mushi was aware of the inroads made by social sciences into what was the traditional domain of history. At the same time, he found in literature, especially Urdu literature and Urdu poetry, of which he was a great enthusiast, the resources, insights, ideas, and explanations for the predicaments of our past and present. This made him a staunch advocate of interdisciplinary teaching and research processes. His interest in interdisciplinary studies found expression in the initiative he took in establishing a number of centers which could bring together academics from across disciplines. The roots of Mushi's success as an institution builder lay in his political passion, geniality, generosity, extensive network of friendships, and an extraordinary capacity to work with and take along others. This helped him to attract and recruit to Jamia Millia a number of dedicated scholars and teachers from different disciplines who made significant contributions to the development of knowledge in our country. Not surprisingly, Jamia drew a wide range of talent under Mushi, as no other institution did at this time, even giving stiff competition to Jawaharlal Nehru University in attracting talented young faculty. The rich legacy that Mushi has left behind for Jamia Millia has been further enriched in recent years, and I'm sure it will be further enhanced in the coming years. The latest National Institutional Ranking Framework, the NIRF, has already placed Jamia Millia within the top 10 of the country's universities. Mushi was especially keen on promoting and supporting research in various aspects of modern Indian history, society, culture, and politics. As a tribute to his intellectual and institution-building work, and the sharp mark he left on Jamia Millia, which he imbued with new ways of thinking and with principles and values of secular nationalism and humanism that came to mark him, I have proposed the establishment of a Mushir Hassan endowment in Jamia Millia. I'm extremely happy that Jamia Millia has accepted my proposal. I'm particularly thankful and beholden to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, for her enthusiastic response to this proposal and in taking the required and quick action for its institution on the 15th of August, which happens to be Moshe's birthday. Above all, I'm truly grateful to Moshe's many wonderful friends and colleagues in Jamia Millia and outside, in India and abroad, who supported and sustained him over the years. I can't adequately thank them for their support, and some among them were keen that an endowment should be established in Jamia Millia to commemorate his life and labor and in recognition of his academic and institutional contributions. The idea of this endowment is to focus, as the Vice Chancellor has stated, is to focus on the study of India's modern history and to encourage and support young academics who are interested in pursuing research and writing and publishing their doctoral work as a book on topics related to India before and after independence. With this aim, we've suggested that the postdoctoral fellowship should be open to applicants from all disciplines in the humanities and social sciences and to candidates from all universities in India. The endowment fund will provide an annual Mushir Hassan postdoctoral fellowship carrying a stipend of 50,000 rupees a month, which will be given for a year and will be open, as I just said, to candidates in all fields of humanities and social sciences. It will provide for 2 postgraduate merit cum means Mushir Hassan scholarships for the MA program, carrying a stipend of rupees 10,000, and it will be available each year to 1 female and 1 male student of faculty of humanities and faculty of social sciences, and an annual seminar on any theme related to the contemporary history of India. And I'm particularly keen on the seminar because all of you know Mushir was greatly devoted to organizing seminars and conferences, and that is how we got Jamia really onto the national and international map. I do hope that the Mushir Hassan Endowment will contribute in taking forward Mushir's academic legacy and our collective commitment to academic excellence and the promotion of critical scholarship in various aspects of contemporary society and our evolving history, politics, and economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zoya Hassan. Thank you so much for all your tireless efforts to honor and preserve the contribution and memory of Professor Mushirul Hassan in Jamia and in the academic community in India and abroad. We thank you for your generous endowment, for the generous endowment that you've given to Jamia. And we are sure that our students and research scholars will amply benefit from them. We are also happy to have got an opportunity to honor his memory today and for all the help that you gave to Jamia to organize this program here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Zoya Hassan. I now call upon Dr. Muhammad Asaduddin, Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Languages, Jamia, to talk about Professor Mushirul Hassan, eminent historian and former Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia from 2004 to 2009, and to whose memory we dedicate this lecture here today. Professor Asaduddin. Professor Asaduddin, may I ask you to speak now?
Good evening, all the honored guests. Good morning, Professor Bose. That Mushirul Hassan was a scholar, historian, and institution builder is known to everybody. With close to 24 books published by transnational publishers of high standing, his scholarship will remain undisputed. Scholarship that broke new grounds in several core areas like Muslim intellectual history of the 19th century, independence movement, partition of the country, and the history of the Qasbas, particularly the Qasbas of Awadh. As for institution building, it is fairly evident to anyone who has followed his work in Jamia as its Vice Chancellor and the National Archives as its Director General. For Jamia, it can be said without exaggeration that he found it brick and left it marble, to quote an English poet. Much of what we are today in Jamia owes to him substantially, and it is in the fitness of things that we have gathered here today in his fond memory to celebrate his life and legacy. I have been asked, however, to talk about Musharriful Hasan, the person. And the Vice Chancellor was specific about that. Because she told me that people know about his scholarship, others will talk about his erudition and his academic excellence. You try to bring about certain unknown facets of his personality. That is, the person behind the persona, the person behind the formal trappings of office, the person that he was in informal, intimate, unguarded moments when he let his hair down and came across as a common human being in interpersonal relationships. There's a popular saying in French, laissez-les l'homme, which means the style is the man. Person's demeanor, dress, mannerism, the way he interacts with others convey much of his internal qualities. This could not have been more true of Mushir Saab. There was nothing put on or affected about him. The first thing that struck a person when he met him for the first time was his total informality and affability. Usually, scholars of his standing are known to be somewhat stiff-necked and snobbish, but Mushir Saab was always accessible if you had something worthwhile to share with him. Forms and rituals were less important to him than substance. However, easy accessibility did not mean he would suffer mean-minded, scheming individuals. And often, they would be the target of his sharp and witty verbs. And I would here crave your indulgence to narrate an incident when the university librarian of a long time ago, who had recently taken charge, had gone to invite him for the inaugural of a new block. Mushir Saab told him that he was busy on that day and suggested that the earlier librarian, who had retired a couple of weeks ago after a distinguished career, might be invited to do the honors. The new librarian tried to find excuses not to call the retired colleague. Mushir Saab listened to his excuses for a minute, then lifted his gaze, stared at him hard and said, "So you don't believe in respecting your seniors? After they have given their best, they should be booted out and shown any courtesy." That comment froze the man, and he didn't know where to look. He somehow muttered his apologies and made his escape. When the door closed behind him, Mushir Saab looked at me, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. He said, "I hope you enjoyed his discomfiture. I can't stand this low-level chicanery and pettiness." Anyone who knew him intimately knew that Mushir Saab had his indulgence about human weaknesses and human frailties, but he would never stand for pettiness and meanness from anyone. Musharriful Hasan had an inherently democratic temper. He had become the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Languages at a fairly young age, in 1990, if I remember correctly. I had joined Jamia a couple of years earlier. In the faculty meetings, I saw him generating healthy debates that were pertinent to the study of humanities and giving space to every shade of opinion, even if it came from the youngest colleague. When he was the Vice Chancellor, The usual sight in the campus was he would be moving around in the white ambassador, sitting in the front seat with his driver Parvez. Incidentally, Mushir Saab ka ghar ka naam Parvez hi tha, and I remember Professor Zoya Hassan addressing him by that name always. So that his white ambassador would be going around the campus, he would wave his hand at the known faces, getting down at spots that would catch his attention, and then faculty members and students would gather around him and draw his attention to some issue or the other. He would engage them in conversations to understand their perspectives on relevant issues. He not only had his ear to the ground, he knew every inch of the campus, every nook and cranny like the back of his hand, and had his ideas about how the spots could be developed for optimal academic and aesthetic purposes. He was gregarious and loved to entertain friends and be entertained by them. And just now, Professor Zoya Hassan has pointed out that fortunately, he had such a large network of friends globally. He was an elegant conversationalist. He always loved a good story, even some intellectual or literary gossip, if you like, without any malice. And when the punchline was delivered, he would break out in full-throated laughter that would reverberate through the room where he would be in company with his friends. What one found particularly heartwarming was the way he interacted with younger colleagues and invited them for collaboration in his work, thus providing much needed launching pads for them. Many of us younger colleagues wrote piggyback on him to get our books published by international publishers. He would invite them to his house, I mean younger colleagues, younger friends from all walks of life, all professions. And he and Professor Zoya Hassan would be the most generous of hosts, making the guest comfortable in all respects. A generation of scholars would miss those evenings filled with collegiality, good conversation, and good food served by this extraordinary generous scholar couple. Mushir Saab's literary and aesthetic sensibilities were evident in his writings and in the cultural life of Jamia, where his speeches were punctuated with poetry, where each building, each structure, each gate, and each patch of green was given an evocative name and assumed a character of its own. Ghalib, Mir Taqi, Hakim Ajmal Khan, Rabindranath Tagore, Ramanujan, Edward Said, Yasser Arafat, Noam Chomsky, Fidel Castro, Quratullah Haider, M.F. Hussein. Taking a tour of the campus, even now, is like taking a lesson on the personalities who enriched world culture and civilization. He had a passion for naming every object and every places, and that indicates that he had a vision for the university. He had a lofty concept of the very idea of the university, and he tried to actualize it in Jamia, working for it selflessly and tirelessly. With all his scholarship and academic success, he was neither self-obsessed nor suffered from any kind of self-delusion. When anyone praised him in exaggerated terms, he would accept the compliment as any cultured person would, but then would resort to self-deprecating humor and wit to indicate that he was grounded enough and that he very well knew his position in the scheme of things. On such occasions, he would often recite Ghalib's verse. Professor Zoya Hassan a while ago has told us about his passion for literature and poetry. And these two verses I remember particularly. वो कहेंगे हम कहाँ के दाना थे, किस हुनर के से यकता थे, बेसबब हुआ गालिब दुश्मन आसमां अपना. Another verse from Ghalib that would occur in his letters to Jamia colleagues and students, that he would address frequently, because those were the days when social media was not available. He would write long letters to his colleagues and students. And this particular couplet would also occur in the long telephonic conversations that we sometimes had. And I'm stressing it because I think it contained the philosophy of his life. The verse is, लिखते रहे जुनू की हिकायात खूच का, हर चंद इसमें हाथ हमारे कलम हुए. A rough translation is, I kept writing the blood-soaked chronicle of my life till my hands were chopped off. One could see that perhaps that is a metaphorical encapsulation of his own life. One touchstone of a successful life is perhaps to see how many lives it has touched. Mushir Sahib's life touched the lives of so many and transformed them for the better. Such a life deserves to be celebrated, memorialized, even monumentalized. I would like to imagine our gathering this evening is the beginning of that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asaduddin, for delivering your tribute to Professor Musharraf Hasan on behalf of Jamias, teachers, scholars, and the wider community in and outside Jamia who knew him personally or in a professional capacity. Thank you, Professor, for speaking on behalf of all of us. Now it is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Sugato Bose, who will deliver the inaugural Musharraf Hasan Memorial Lecture 2020. Professor Sugato Bose, eminent historian and scholar of modern Indian history, was born in Kolkata and educated at Presidency College and the University of Cambridge, where he obtained his PhD. Currently, Sugato Bose is the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. He has served as Director of Graduate Studies in History at Harvard and as the founding director of Harvard South Asia Institute. Prior to taking up the Gardiner Chair at Harvard University in 2001, Professor Bose was a Fellow of St. Catherine's College, University of Cambridge, and Professor of History and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His areas of teaching have been modern South and Southeast Asian history, Indian Ocean history in comparative perspective, historiography, economic history of Asia, British imperialism, and global history. His scholarship has contributed to a deeper understanding of colonial and post-colonial history, economy, and the interface between rural and urban arenas of travel, trade, and imagination across the Indian Ocean, besides ethical discourses, political philosophy, and economic thought. His books include Agrarian Bengal, Economy, Social Structure and Politics, 1986, Peasant Labor and Colonial Capital, 1993, Modern South Asia, History, Culture, Political Economy, 1998, with Aisha Dalal, 100 Horizons, The Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, 2006, His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose, and India's Struggle Against Empire, published in 2011, and The Nation as Mother, and Other Visions of Nationhood, published in 2017, are his best-known publications. A volume of essays, jointly edited with Aisha Khan, titled Oceanic Islam, Muslim Universalism, and European Imperialism, has been published in 2020. He is currently writing a book on Asia after Europe, and is general editor of the Cambridge History of the Indian Ocean. He was a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and delivered the G.M. Trevelyan Lecture at the University of Cambridge. We are really, truly honored to have Professor Bose deliver the first memorial lecture. But there are a few more things that I wish to speak about him, which must be mentioned. Sugata Bose, perhaps many know and many do not know, did serve as a member of parliament in India, elected to the 16th Lok Sabha 2014 to 2019, representing the Jadavpur constituency in West Bengal. And throughout that period, he was a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Some of the prizes and honors he has received are Robindra Puraskar, highest literary award of Bengal, named after Tagore, Jean Meyer Global Citizenship Award 2010, Tufts University Distinguished Scholar Award 2000. We are honored to have Professor Sugata Bose with us here today. And since the audience is eagerly waiting to listen to him, I now invite him to deliver the inaugural Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lecture. Jamia is proud as to deliver this lecture today. Professor Bose, I invite you to deliver the first Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lecture.
Thank you very much. I hope I can be heard in India.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, Professor Zoya Hassan, Dean Muhammad Asaduddin, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Rumki Basu, fellow scholars and students. It is an honor tinged with sadness to be asked to deliver the inaugural Mushirul Hasan Memorial Lecture at Jamia Millia University in its centenary year. By the time I arrived at the University of Cambridge in the autumn of 1978, Mushir had already received his PhD there the previous year. It was in Cambridge that I first met him when he returned a few years later to participate in a conference. After that, for more than 3.5 decades, I was privileged to know him as a leading light among historians of India, an able and far-sighted academic administrator and institution builder, a human being who exuded kindness and civility, and a dear friend. For anyone wishing to understand the history of Muslim society, culture, ethics, and politics in India from the 18th century to the present, his scholarly works are indispensable. They inspire us in this fraught moment, if I may use the title of one of Mushirul Hasan's books, to engage in a moral reckoning with India's past, present, and future. On my last visit to Jamia a few years ago, I stood in front of the statue of Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar to pay my respects. I could not but reflect on how poorly this great compatriot of Mahatma Gandhi in 1920 is remembered in today's India. He was an exemplar of an Indian anti-colonialism that exceeded the limits of territorial nationalism and forged wider solidarities against Western imperialist aggression. An Asian universalist aspiration was one, though not the only form taken by this quest to move beyond the nation in an age of nationalism. The news from Asia today presents a picture of a fractured continent riven by nationalist rivalries. Yet underlying developments reveal a closer economic and cultural intertwining, perhaps more than ever before. If the idea of Europe could survive the carnage of 2 world wars, as well as current economic and cultural tensions, the idea of Asia needs to be evaluated in terms of its ability to withstand similar stresses and strains. Okakura Tenshin's 1903 book, The Ideals of the East, had a memorable first sentence: Asia is one. Sister Nivedita added a further embellishment in her introduction to the book. Asia, the great mother, she wrote, is forever one. There were multiple articulations and alternative visions of this famous claim, and many disagreements about the extent to which it was tenable. The idea of Asia formed the subject of vigorous intellectual debates. Asia, as a space and a concept in the writings of Asian thinkers, many variations on the theme notwithstanding, contained a creative spark absent in the European cartographic depictions of Asia. A world historical transformation is underway in the early 21st century as Asia recovers the global position it had lost some 200 years ago. The great divergence in the economic fortunes of Asia and Europe that began around 1820 is being reversed in 2020. While political leaders have been responding to recent shifts in the balance of global economic and political power, the idea of Asia and the spirit of Asian universalism were alive and expressed in a variety of registers throughout the period of European imperial domination. One of the most innovative exponents of an Asia sense was Rabindranath Tagore. Each country of Asia will solve its own historical problems according to its strength, nature, and need, Tagore said during his visit to Iran in 1932. But the lamp that they will each carry on their path to progress will converge to illuminate the common ray of knowledge. Addressing the faculty and students of Tokyo Imperial University on June 10, 1924, Tagore made a moving reference to one of your idealists who had a large heart and a great originality of mind. His name was Okakura. From him, Tagore declared, we first came to learn that there was such a thing as an Asiatic mind. On the eve of his departure from Japan on June 20, 1924, Tagore noted the patience and time the people of that country took to give beauty to everything that is for daily use. This, he said, is the genuine spirit of hospitality. For things that are beautiful are hospitable. His 1924 voyage had been undertaken in search of a better understanding between China, Japan, and India, and to preach the fundamental unity of the Asiatic mind. Tagore was quick to explain that he did not consider any quality to be exclusively Oriental. All great human ideals are universal, he asserted. Only in their grouping, emphasis, and expression they differ from one another. Okakura's book, The Ideals of the East, was very substantially a collaborative effort of a Japanese and an Irish art critic. The history of Japanese art was for Okakura the history of Asiatic ideals, the beach where each successive wave of Eastern thought has left its sand ripple. Nivedita lauded Okakura for having shown Asia not as the congeries of geographical fragments that we imagine, but as a united living organism, each part dependent on all the others, the whole breathing a single complex life. The Swadeshi cultural milieu of early 20th century India, despite its interest in rejuvenating indigenous traditions and industries was not wholly inward-looking. Its protagonists were curious about innovations in different parts of the globe. Abanindranath Tagore's iconic image of Bharat Mata was executed in the Japanese wash technique he had learned from the great Japanese painter Yokoyama Taikan. In 1905, the Ottoman reformer in Egypt, Mustafa Kamil, had written about Japan as a model for the rest of Asia. The Ottoman Meiji ties went back to 1889, when Sultan Abdul Hamid had sent a large ship named Ertugrul, which tragically sank in 1890 after a grand reception in Yokohama. From November 1908 to June 1909, Abdul Rashid Ibrahim visited Japan and took part in Asianist confabulations. The historian Selçuk Esenbul has shown the intricacies in the relationship between Japan and Turkey, as well as Buddhism and Islam. Halid Edip, a Turkish nationalist feminist, was one of many women to name her son Togo after the famous Japanese admiral who had sunk the Russian fleet. Mehmet Akif, future composer of Turkey's national anthem, depicted his friend Ibrahim preaching Islam in the form of the Buddha in his epic poem Safahat. In Japan, Ibrahim met Muhammad Barkatullah, an Indian supporter of the Ottoman Empire and professor of Hindustani at Tokyo University. Hailing from the princely state of Bhopal, Barkatullah had journeyed through the United Kingdom and the United States of America to Japan to attempt a modus vivendi between the affinities of Asia and Islam. In 1909, with the help of Hassan Hatano Uho, he launched the journal Islamic Fraternity, which circulated in Southeast Asia. On his return voyage from Japan, Ibrahim went to China, the Dutch East Indies, and British India, spreading the twin messages of Asian solidarity and Islamic fraternity. In paying an obituary tribute to Mustafa Kamil in 1908, the Bengali Swadeshi leader Aurobindo Ghosh pointed out in Vande Mataram how the Ottoman reformer balanced the religious solidarity of Islam as a moral asset with the distinct existence of Egyptian nationality. Asia is not Europe and never will be Europe, Aurobindo wrote in another essay titled Asiatic Democracy. He acknowledged that much of Europe's political history will unfold in Asia, but that Asia would, quote, transmute it in her own temperament, unquote. As Japan became the cynosure of Asian eyes from 1904 to 1905, the Japanese visionary of oneness of Asia, Okakura, found a base in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. In 1906 appeared Okakura's Book of Tea, giving historians an opportunity to speak of a gentle teaist strand of Asian universalism. The subtle charm of tea made sure that it did not have the arrogance of wine, the self-consciousness of coffee, nor the simpering innocence of cocoa. But Okakura refused to be a polite teaist while criticizing the unfavorable Western attitude towards understanding the East. He was outspoken in his criticism before calling upon the continents to stop hurling epigrams at each other. He wrote, "European imperialism, which does not disdain to raise the absurd cry of the yellow peril, fails to realize that Asia may also awaken to the cruel sense of the white disaster. You may laugh at us for having too much tea, but maybe not suspect that you of the West have no tea in your constitution." My colleague Akira Irie sees teaism as evoking the shared civilizational beauty of Asia, helping their people to regain their self-confidence so that they would once again be able to contribute to the world's civilization. Tagore and Okakura met again in Boston in February 1913. There is evidence to suggest that Tagore came in late January and early February to visit Okakura, who was then instrumental in getting him invited to give a series of lectures at Harvard. Babu Robindra came yesterday with his son and his charming daughter-in-law, Okakura wrote to Priyamvata Devi Banerjee on February 4th, 1913. I'm hoping to make their short stay here as little of a bore as possible, though of course, being a stranger myself, I cannot do much. Their presence here makes me feel that you are not far from me. The concept of Asia figured in their conversations. After Tagore's departure, following his first set of lectures, Okakura wrote again on March 3rd, 1913. Your uncle has left for Chicago, and I feel a sudden loneliness. Okakura had been warmly embraced by Boston's intellectual and cultural elite since 1904, being feted at the soirees hosted by Isabella Gardner at her newly constructed palazzo close to the Museum of Fine Arts. He had held exhibitions of the paintings by Yokoyama Taikan at the home of Sarah Bull at 168 Brattle Street, Cambridge. Yet his self-identification as a stranger and feeling of loneliness on the departure of his friend, whom he had encountered only fleetingly, was not an affectation and must be seen as evidence of an affective bond forged in the name of Asia. On his eastward voyage to Japan in 1916, Tagore had journeyed from Calcutta to Rangoon, Penang, Singapore, and Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, he made an uncannily accurate prophecy about the future balance of power in the world. The nations which now own the world's resources, he contended, fear the rise of China and wish to postpone the day of that rise. The ship Tosamaru took him to Japan, where he spent 3 months. It represented the fulfillment not just of a personal quest, but the search for an Asian universalism that had begun at the turn of the 20th century. His direct encounter with the perfection of art in Japan led him to urge Indian artists to look east in order to pioneer a fresh departure from the Swadeshi corpus of ideals. Japanese art impressed Tagore, the Japanese penchant for imitating European nationalistic imperialism less so. It was only after rebuking Japan on that count that Tagore undertook the long Pacific crossing to North America in September 1916. He went on a lecture tour from the west to the east coast of the United States, delivering his powerful critique of nationalism. Like 2020, 1916 was a presidential election season. Woodrow Wilson won re-election by a small margin, claiming that he had kept his country out of war. A year before Tagore's visit, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, the future father of Indian sociology, had arrived in Japan, crossing the Pacific in the other direction from the United States. Sarkar's major English works have been receiving belated scholarly attention from historians. His travel writings in Bengali, by contrast, have remained neglected, even though they are arguably the best sources for understanding the effective bond forged with an entity called Asia. In 1915-1916, Sarkar spent 3 months in Japan and nearly 10 months in China. His essays on Japan were published during those years in journals before appearing as a book titled Nobin Asia Janmodata Japan, the birth giver of New Asia Japan, in 1923. In his introduction to the book version, Sarkar mentioned that Indians often ask, are the Japanese friends or enemies of Asia? The problem with this line of enquiry would become apparent if one asked similar questions as to whether the Germans or the English or the French were friends or enemies of Europe? The answer regarding Japan would be the same as any to those types of questions. He discussed this matter at various places in his Kitab. By 1923, Tokyo was no longer the only capital of free Asia. Ankara was also a new center of this freedom. To Japan, according to Sarkar, went the credit of being the Dikha Data, giver of initiation, and Shikha Guru, mentor of young India, young China, young Afghanistan, young Iran, and young Egypt. For 3 months, Sarkar launched into a systematic study tour of all aspects of Japanese life, its social norms and learned institutions, based on varied interactions with its prominent and ordinary citizens. By mid-August 1915, Sarkar mused, "What have I seen in Japan?" His reflections in answer to that question underscore a dramatic contrast between his travel experiences in Asia and Euro-America. He writes, "In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place, khapchara, in those societies. They too were unable to accept me as one of their own. I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan. Yet standing on any street, in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In their gait and look, their posture, their manner of speech, their laughter and humor, their modest and respectful demeanor, their customs of greeting and serving guests, in all these matters, I have found India. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported lohalakkur, some scraps of iron from Euro-America." Now, Sarkar was admitted into the circle of scholars and artists in New York and Boston during 1914, 1915, and 1917 to 1919. Yet it was his feeling oddly out of place, recorded candidly in his Bengali writing, that was depicted in Florine Stetheimer's oil painting, Studio Party or Soiree. In it, Sarkar's still figure is placed as an exotic fig leaf in front of Florine's self-portrait on the wall of a studio, the venue of an animated avant-garde soiree. The awkwardness of Sarkar's pose, Manu Goswami has commented, belies the centrality of his placement. For Sarkar, it was not a pose. He felt awkward or khapchara in this milieu. The intellectual engagement with Euro-America and the affective bond with Asia represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a new global future. What struck Sarkar on his arrival in China was the durdasha, misfortune afflicting that country. Everywhere he could see the domination of the foreigner. As in Japan, he proceeded to keep a record of his trip in Bengali. The travelogue was completed in its entirety by June 1916 and published in full as a book titled Bottoman Juge Chin Samrajyo, The Chinese Empire in the Present Age, in 1921. He dedicated the book to Kang Yu Wei and Liang Qiqiao, who deserved the reverence of young Asia. Sarkar's English book, Chinese Religion Through Hindu Eyes, was the product of his research in Shanghai. Neither historically nor philosophically, Sarkar stated in the opening of his preface, does Asiatic mentality differ from the Euro-American. Only after the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century had the alleged difference been broached and then grossly exaggerated. The pseudo-scientific theories or fancies regarding race, religion, and culture that vitiated the present were unknown to the world down to the second or third decade of the 19th century. This was Sarkar's opening salvo in the devastating critique of the comparative method of Orientalism that would be the hallmark of his scholarly works in later years. For insights into the psychology of intimacy evoked in early 20th century Asian encounters, one has to fall back on Sarkar's Bengali travel writing rather than his erudite scholarship in English. Especially fascinating was what Sarkar had to say about Chinese Muslims and the role of Islam in undergirding Asian unity. Theorizing on this subject had come a long way from Okakura's emphasis on the Buddhist arc. In Japan and China, he had seen Buddhists and understood their historical relationship with India. But the music that sprang from my heartstrings, as soon as I encountered Muslims here, he wondered, why did it not sound on the same strings when I met the Chinese and Japanese Buddhist worshippers of Shakyamuni? What could explain the special property of the special way in which he considered Chinese, Iranian, Egyptian Muslims to be his very own? Maybe, Sarkar answered, India, and then in parenthesis, I cannot remember the four corners of that vast country. Let me speak of Bengal. India or Bengal is not just Hindustan, it is also Musalmanistan. And then he writes a lyrical passage where he describes how from their birth, Hindu friends played with Muslim friends and children of both faiths grew up together. After that, in bazaars, shops and markets, in grazing pastures and agricultural fields, in religious fairs and religious practices, in festivities and in distress, in famines and in cemeteries, Muslims were companions of Hindus and Hindus were companions of Muslims. The blood and breath of Hindus and Muslims were inextricably mixed. The bond forged by this companionship, dwelling together, and brotherhood, Sarkar believed, was unbreakable. Cerebral reasoning, philosophical discourses, and historical scholarship revealed the relationship of Hindus and Buddhists. But could discoveries of the head, Sarkar, who was from Malda in Bengal, asked, create the chains of enchantment strung by pulls of the heart? Pioneering the comparative study of Chinese and Indian empires, Sarkar queried young China's terminology that characterized the anti-Manchu Republican Revolution of September 1911 as anti-foreign. Sarkar made an insightful comparison of the structure and ideology of Chinese and Indian empires. As with the Holy Roman Empire in Europe and the Mughal Empire in India, in China also, the de facto independence of the provinces and the formal vassals was never regarded as inconsistent with the de jure imperium of the Huangti, Sarvabhauma, or world sovereign. China, quite as much as India, was a pluralistic universe in spite of the fundamental unity of cultural ideals pervading the entire area. Just as the rule of Muslim sovereigns in India was not an alien rule, so also the rule of the Manchus in China was, according to Sarkar, not a foreign rule. The search for new imaginations of Asia was matched by efforts to turn the continent into a connected field of political resistance to Western imperialism. Several variants of Asian universalism were articulated during World War I. For Indian and Chinese revolutionaries, Japan was a base or a refuge for political action. Among scholars, Binoy Kumar Sarkar had come to Japan and China mainly to learn, while Tagore journeyed to Japan and the United States primarily to teach his ethics of the imperative to rise above the nation. In the immediate aftermath of this cataclysmic conflict, the idea of Asia propounded by anti-colonial thinkers and activists would have to contend and come to terms with other universalisms of both the religious and secular assortments. We have now the opportunity of a lifetime, Mahatma Gandhi wrote in one of his essays titled Hindu-Muslim Unity in Young India on May 11th, 1921. Under Gandhi's leadership, Indian anti-colonial nationalism became a mass movement during the global Islamic universalist moment from 1919 to 1922. This was hardly a Wilsonian moment. If the euphoria over Japan's military victory had linked Indian nationalism with Asian universalism in 1905, the anguish over Ottoman Turkey's military defeat connected Indian nationalism with Muslim universalism in 1919. The Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917 opened the alluring prospect for anti-colonialism to forge another dimension of transnational solidarity with communist internationalism at war's end. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's pronouncements on the colonial and national questions elicited thoughtful and sometimes enthusiastic Asian responses. The Khilafat Committee formally adopted Gandhi's non-cooperation program on May 20th, 1920, before the Indian National Congress did so by a large majority at its special Calcutta session in September, presided over by Lala Lajpat Rai. Another legendary leader of the older generation, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, had already blessed the green flag of the Khilafat before his death on August 1st, 1920. In October 1920, Swami Shraddhanand, who had addressed a gathering at the Jama Masjid in Delhi the previous year, appeared in Burma, a province of British India since 1886, to be welcomed by Muslims and Buddhists into the Shwedagon Pagoda. Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim universalisms could peacefully coexist and reinforce one another at a moment when anti-colonial nationalism was not hamstrung by notions of rigid territoriality. The non-cooperation resolution of the Congress was, of course, ratified at the annual Nagpur session in December 1920. That year, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad took strong exception to the term pan-Islamism. He wrote in an essay, Masli Khilafat wa Jazirat al-Arab, that Muslims subscribed to the ideal of universal brotherhood, which was different and therefore a non-territorial conception of nationality. It was wrongly dubbed pan-Islamism, according to him. A strenuous objection to the prefix pan attached in colonial discourse to both Islamism and Asianism was common at this time to proponents of Muslim and Asian universalisms alike. Woodrow Wilson's racism has become a focal point of attention and condemnation in 2020. Princeton, for example, has removed his name from their School of International Affairs. His championing of white supremacy was well known 100 years ago in 1919-1920, but at that time, such an attitude meshed well with the global power dynamics that buttressed Western imperialist domination. Japan's advocacy of a racial equality clause in the founding principles of the League of Nations fell on deaf ears. Even Asian ideologues, deeply skeptical of Japanese versions of Asianism, were not prepared to abandon the quest for a more generous form of Asian solidarity. Perhaps the most insightful among such figures was Lee Da-Zhao, who had spent several years in Japan and studied at Waseda University. If Leon Trotsky could envision a Republican United States of Europe, Lee Da-Zhao allowed himself to entertain the possibility of a United States of Asia. In the aftermath of World War I, Moscow beckoned those Asians who could not get a hearing in the corridors of power in the capitals of Western Europe. And we find that at the second Congress of the Comintern was followed by a Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku on the Caspian Sea in early September 1920. Standing on the cusp of Europe and Asia, Grigory Zinoviev called upon the peoples of the East to wage a true jihad against their oppressors, especially the British imperialists. Enver Pasha made an appearance in Baku, even though he was restrained from playing the stellar role he coveted for himself. The erstwhile Young Turk gradually lost faith in an alliance with the Bolsheviks, and he died fighting against the Soviet regime near the Afghan frontier in August 1922. If the bond between Islam and Bolshevism had broken in Central Asia, its prospects were still alive in Southeast Asia. At the Fourth Congress of the Comintern in November 1922, Tan Malaka made an impassioned plea in German for a modus vivendi between international communism and Muslim universalism, which signified for him anti-imperialist resistance across the globe. Meanwhile, in India, the boycott of British goods and institutions proceeded apace in 1921. In Bengal, a broad foundation of Hindu-Muslim unity was laid under the leadership of Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, whose 150th birth anniversary this year is going virtually unnoticed in Delhi. The Congress called for a boycott of the visit by the Prince of Wales in November. The shutdown was successful in Calcutta. It resulted in the imprisonment of Chittaranjan Das and his young lieutenant, Subhash Chandra Bose. With Das, the president-elect of the Congress, in jail, the Congress met for its annual Ahmedabad session in December 1921 under the presidency of Hakim Ajmal Khan. The following year, in his presidential address on December 26, 1922, at the Gaya Congress, Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das envisioned the participation of India in the Great Asiatic Federation, which he saw in the course of formation. The swing in the pendulum back from an emphasis on Muslim to Asian universalism for oppressed nationalities was understandable in light of rapid changes in Turkey. In June 1923, the Turks gave up any claims to temporal and spiritual authority over the holy places in the Arabian Peninsula. October 1923 saw the formal transformation of the empire into a republic. When the Congress convened in December 1923 for its annual session in Kokonada, the President Muhammad Ali gave a spirited address on India as a federation of faiths. Once Kemal Ataturk finally abolished the Khilafat in March 1924, the time had come once more to travel and look east. In 1924, many Indian nationalists rekindled the lamp of Asian universalism. That year, Tagore set off for East Asia again, accompanied by a painter, Nandalal Bose, and two scholars of comparative religion and politics, Kiti Mohan Sen and Kalidas Nag. One of Tagore's hosts that year in China was none other than Liang Qiqiao. In welcoming Tagore, Liang evoked the age-old brotherly affection between India and China. The radical Chinese youth, who had their baptism of fire in the May 4th movement of 1919, mistook the modern Indian poet to be a traditionalist and derided the messenger of spirituality from a defeated nation. Tagore's advocacy of a shared Asian cultural universe had a mixed reception. Hurt by the passage of the Orientals Exclusion Act in the United States, Tagore's friends and admirers set up an Asiatic Association in Shanghai to further the cause of Asian unity. In Japan, the Asian Universalist turn in the domain of art was alive and well. Nandalal Bose had the privilege of being hosted by Tagore's friend Taikkan, and he was introduced to masterpieces of Japanese art. That same year, on November 28, 1924, Sun Yat-sen delivered an important political address in Japan on the significance of Greater Asianism in the resistance against Western imperialism. Liberating the phrase from the pejorative meaning Li Dazhao had associated with it, Sun's speech spelled out the full range of supranational solidarity from Russia to Japan and Turkey to India that might be harnessed by Asian anti-colonial movements. In conclusion, Sun Yat-sen tossed a challenge to his Japanese audience. Japan today has become acquainted with the Western civilization of the rule of might, but retains the characteristics of the Oriental civilization of the rule of right. Now the question remains whether Japan will be the hawk of the Western civilization of the rule of might or the tower of strength of the Orient. This is the choice which lies before the people of Japan. Bolshevism's imbrication with Asianism and Islamism unraveled during 1926 and 1927. The alliance that had been built by the Mikhail Borodin mission unraveled in Wuhan during 1927. And also the PKI revolution in Indonesia was crushed, and that proved to be a very major setback for radical politics. Near the close of the decade, Tagore made a final visit to East Asia on his way back from the United States in 1929. By then, it was the continued discriminatory policies and practices of the West that prevented internal fissures in Asia from breaking out into the open. Tagore was especially grateful for the shelter of Japanese hospitality in May 1929, soon after he had a humiliating encounter with US immigration officials in Los Angeles. He came by the Japanese ship Tayamaru and composed a poem titled A Weary Pilgrim for the Asahi Shimbun. Send thy welcome signal, O rising sun, open the golden gate at the ancient shrine of the East, where dwells the spirit of man, great as the grass that blesses the lowly dust, and meek as the mountain under stars. Once in Tokyo, he called for Japanese statesmanship to be conducted with sympathy and understanding towards its weaker neighbors. If the streams of Asian universalism and communist internationalism diverged from 1927 onwards, the intertwining of Asian and Muslim universalisms had a much longer afterlife than might have been expected following 1924. With the collapse of the Khilafat movement and the end of the Ottoman Empire, Ayesha Jalal has argued the political connections between Muslims in India and West Asia were tested and reinforced rather than disrupted. The Khilafat Committee continued to function, and Muhammad Ali Johar attended the first Mu'tammar al-Alam al-Islami, World Islamic Conference at Mecca in December 1926. Indian Muslims had differences in their attitude towards Ibn Saud, and the Saudi hostility towards the tombs and shrines of the Prophet and his family in Medina upset many Indian pilgrims. However, Indian Muslims were at one in the valorizing of the nation-state form being privileged in global affairs since 1919. At Muhammad Ali's funeral in Jerusalem in January 1931, his elder brother Shaukat Ali and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem decided to convene a second World Islamic Conference. No one gave more eloquent expression to a different universalism of Muslims in South and West Asia than Muhammad Iqbal, who attended that conference in Jerusalem in November 1931. Ayesha Jalal points out in a recent book that we edited, Oceanic Islam, that Iqbal regretted that the spirit of Islamic universalism had been misconstrued in Europe as something akin to the Yellow Peril. In an interview to the Bombay Chronicle during his Indian Ocean voyage in September 1931, he said that the spectre of pan-Islamism had been conjured up in the fertile imagination of a lone French journalist. A travesty of Muslim sentiments in favor of unity against European aggression, Iqbal proposed dropping pan from the phrase as Islamism sufficed to convey the Muslim desire for a faith-based solidarity that was more of a social experiment than the political project Europeans imagined it to be. Much the same could be said at this time about the needless prefix pan attached to the sentiments of Asianism. Tagore traveled to West Asia in April and May 1932. In his book Parashe, he recalled his voyage to Japan in 1916 to witness the awakening on the eastern horizon of Asia. Subsequently, he had observed the fall and resurrection of Turkey and had now embarked on a journey to find out how West Asia, particularly Iran and Iraq, were responding to the challenges of the new age. In his book Parashe, Tagore spelled out in the clearest terms his vision of Asian universalism. He visited the graves of Sadi and Hafiz in Shiraz and claimed kinship with these Persian poets. For the English reading public, Tagore wrote an article in the Modern Review later in the year titled Asia's Response to the Call of the New Age. He wrote, "Perhaps in the drama of Europe, the scene is being changed for the fifth act of the play. Signs of an awakening in Asia have slowly spread from one end of the horizon to the other. The glow of the new dawn above the eastern mountain ranges of humanity is indeed a great vision. It is a vision of freedom." Tagore's friend, Charles Freer Andrews, expressed a similar sentiment in an article on Asia in Revolution in the same issue of the journal in October 1932, based on a lecture he gave at the University of Cambridge. Andrews observed the entire continent of Asia in the throes of a vast revolution. The economic depression in Europe and America, he noted astutely, has had an intimate relation to the events which are happening in India and the Far East. The theme of the rise of nationalism captured merely, quote, a superficial aspect, unquote, of the Asian revolt. A deeper analysis revealed, first, an almost entire reaction in Asia against European domination, and second, the uprising at last of the downtrodden peasantry of agricultural Asia against age-long tyranny and oppression. So these were the optimistic views in the early 1930s. Japan's invasion of China in 1937 undermined the idea of Asia as never before. Tagore was dismayed. In 1935, he had warmly received Yune Noguchi in Shantiniketan, as had Mahatma Gandhi in Sevagram and Sarojini Naidu in Hyderabad. Now, Tagore wrote to Noguchi with sorrow and shame, not anger, that he could no longer point out with pride the example of a great Japan. Writing in the Modern Review, Subhash Chandra Bose recalled that Japan had done great things for herself and for Asia, but he lamented, could not Japan's aims be achieved without imperialism, without dismembering the Chinese Republic, without humiliating another proud, cultured, and ancient race? India had to draw some lessons in political ethics from the conflict in East Asia. Standing at the threshold of a new era, he wrote, "Let India resolve to aspire after national self-fulfillment in every direction, but not at the expense of other nations, and not through the bloody path of self-aggrandizement and imperialism." As Congress president in 1938, he sent a medical mission to China, urging its members to link up with another oppressed nation. I have elsewhere addressed the shared Asian experience during World War II, with devastating famines in India, China, and Vietnam, and the complex but generally supportive relations between Asian independence movements between 1941 and 1945. I would especially point out to the relations between India and Burma. In the 1930s, there had been a lot of conflict between Burmese peasants and Indian moneylenders. But during the 1940s, there was understanding between the Burmese and the Indian independence movements. And it was from the tomb, the grave of Bahadur Shah Zafar, that the Indian National Army launched its march towards Delhi in 1943. The limitations of time will not allow me to delve into those themes of the period of the Second World War today. At the end of World War II, the idea of Asia was still alive. Welcoming Sharat Chandra Bose to Burma in July 1946, Aung San evoked the vision of a pan-Asiatic federation in the not too distant future. An Asian Relations Conference was convened in India before independence. On April 1st, 1947, Mahatma Gandhi told the delegates to the conference being held in the Purana Killa that he was in the capital as the Viceroy's prisoner and Nehru's prisoner. He lamented that Indians did not know how to maintain peace. Speaking at the concluding session the next day, he expressed his embarrassment at the shameful carnage unfolding before their very eyes and begged the visitors from abroad to not carry the memory of that carnage beyond the confines of India. By the time Gandhi toured Delhi on September 10th, after preserving peace in Calcutta, the capital of newly free India looked to him like a city of the dead. 2 days later, he visited the Jama Masjid, where 30,000 refugees had congregated, and the Purana Killa, that had been transformed from being the venue of an Asian international conference to a refugee camp for 50,000 helpless people. If India fails, Gandhi warned, Asia dies. On January 12, 1948, Mahatma Gandhi announced his momentous decision to start an indefinite fast to try and bring about a reunion of hearts among all communities. His reward would be regaining India's dwindling prestige and her fast-fading sovereignty over the heart of Asia and therethrough the world. Mahatma Gandhi was quite clear that peace and unity in India was the precondition of India's ability to contribute to Asian universalism. It was the coming into being of post-colonial nation-states with unitary concepts of sovereignty imported from modern Europe that fractured the idea of Asia in its political dimension. Yet even at that moment, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of modern Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, evocatively called in a 1960 lecture, Asia as Method. In the domain of culture, Japanese art enabled the spirit of an Asian universalism to survive Japan's nationalistic imperialism. One example was Nandalal Bose's celebration of the Indian countryside in his art, creatively drawing on the Japanese sumie style. The idea of Asia and the spirit of Asian universalism were in important ways products of cosmopolitan thought zones created by passages across the Indian Ocean. In this sense, the continent and the ocean were not necessarily in an adversarial relationship, but provided different contours of interregional arenas animated by flows of ideas and culture. As the West retreats into parochial neuroses, proclaims a recent study of Asian intellectuals, Asian countries appear more outward-looking, confident, and optimistic. Yet, no alternative intellectual universalism is seen to have successfully challenged the prestige and authority of Western modernity. This view misrecognizes the political failure as intellectual failure. The 4 decades since the end of World War II represented the heyday of the territorial model of the European nation-state in Asia. It is only in the 21st century that universalist aspirations swept aside at the moment of formal political decolonization received a new breath of life. The world of contemporary Asian thought has been grappling to make sense and give direction to emerging trends. Pre-colonial networks of overland and maritime trade and finance, as well as anti-colonial visions of political solidarity, have been invoked in attempts to soften the hard borders of post-colonial nation-states. Asian intellectuals have naturally run ahead of managers of Asian states in creatively trespassing across national boundaries. It may be just as well that Asian connectivity is less state-driven than European integration. The discourse has moved well beyond trumpeting the superiority of Asian values to a much more nuanced articulation of an interconnected and interreferential Asia seeking to shape a global future. The potential of Asia as method, an Asian scholar wrote in 2010, harking back to Takeuchi Yoshimi's essay 50 years ago, is this: using the idea of Asia as an imaginary anchoring point, societies can become each other's points of reference so that the understanding of the self can be transformed and subjectivity rebuilt. The dream of Asian universalism had been shattered in the 20th century by the conflict between Japan and China. Its fate in the 21st century will depend to a very large extent on China and India. Both Asian giants are beset with internal problems of inequity, and the ability to address those may be just as important as the state of their mutual relations, that in any case face current challenges from nationalist posturing. To conclude then, can flows of culture and commerce yet prevail over interstate competition and conflict in a post-imperialist and potentially post-nationalist Asia? In re-envisioning the idea of Asia for what many anticipate will be an Asian century, it is necessary to take a normative and ethical position on the side of a generous universalism against the hubris of an arrogant imperialism and narrow nationalism. The most sophisticated Asian thinkers of the last century aspired to keep that lofty goal in their sights, even if not everyone managed to climb up the slippery slope and reach the peak. No one said it better than Rabindranath Tagore as early as 1932, again on his visit to Iran. He wrote, "We are the people of Asia. Grievances against Europe are in our blood. Ever since their pirates and marauders came to suck the blood of this weak continent in the 18th century, they have disgraced themselves before us. If a new age has dawned in Asia, let Asia give it utterance in a new authentic voice. If instead Asia merely imitates Europe's beastly cry, were it even to be the lion's roar, Shinghonad, it will be a loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bose. I wish we could have hosted this lecture in the Ansari Auditorium in Jamia, and we could have given you a standing ovation today, which you truly deserve. However, we are
Thank you.
quite overwhelmed. I had introduced you as scholar extraordinary. I would be compelled to address you now as an Asian extraordinary. I thank you, Professor, for this thought-provoking and absolutely seminal presentation. I'm quite overwhelmed, and I'm sure the audience is too. In fact, this was the lecture we were waiting for. Not only is it topical and relevant, it also helps us to uplift our Asian mind and spirit, which truly needed a rejuvenation. Thank you so much. But I would now request Professor Prabhat Patnaik to present his comments and observations on your lecture. Professor Prabhat Patnaik from JNU.
Vice Chancellor,
from
Professor Najma Akhtar, Professor Shugata Bose, Professor Asaduddin, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Rumki Boshu, friends. We have just heard an excellent, highly erudite lecture, and I am not really competent to make any comments on this lecture. I'd like to use this opportunity, for which I'm very grateful, to make some remarks of a more general kind about anti-colonial nationalism. A few years ago, in fact, quite a few years ago, Mushir and I, along with some other friends, had gone to Perth to attend a conference on India. On the way back, we stopped over in Kuala Lumpur, where we had a few hours to kill. And of course, we used that opportunity to travel around Kuala Lumpur. And of course, seeing the snazziness of that town, all of us had this feeling that, look, where was Malaysia or Malaya in immediately after the Second World War, and where was India? But on the other hand, you look at Kuala Lumpur and it gives you an impression of enormous prosperity, the like of which you don't find anywhere in India. So we were a little despondent about it. The question kept rising in our heads, where did we go wrong? After thinking about it for some time, I'm now of the opinion that that despondency was really not justified, because the snazziness of a city or the constructions that you find in a city, the impressiveness of buildings and so on, is really not an index or a marker of a nation's revival. As a matter of fact, this was a point which was made clearly by anti-colonial nationalism, which was a very unique phenomenon. I believe that something like anti-colonial nationalism, the ideas that informed anti-colonial nationalism, are ideas which were really quite sui generis. It differed from post-Westphalian European nationalism, and it also differed from all kinds of sectarian nationalisms which we find emerging all over. Anti-colonial nationalism was not only inclusive, but it had a remarkable quality, and the quality was that instead of placing the entity called the nation above the people, for which the people made sacrifices, you actually had the raison d'etre of the nation, consisting in a material improvement in the lives of the people. In fact, this was a very unique conception of a nation. You remember Eric Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. The idea was that people made sacrifices for the nation, while anti-colonial nationalism inverted that relationship. In fact, therefore, in looking at anti-colonial nationalism, its successes and its failures, we really have also to take a perspective which itself represents an inversion of the normal perspective. We really have to look, not in terms of the buildings and the bridges and the construction and the Petronas Tower and so on, but we have to really look at what is happening to the material conditions of the people. And here we come upon a paradox, namely precisely the period in which in India you have had remarkably high growth, you have had remarkably a talk of resurgence, is the period in which the conditions of the people at large have, if anything, retrogressed rather than the period in which we really grew very slowly, but on the other hand, there was an improvement in the conditions of the people. Let me give you a few figures that if you look at the entire history of, a very important marker of the conditions of the people is, of course, the degree to which they are able to allay their hunger. Now, for that, if you look at per capita food grain availability, then in the beginning of the 20th century, that was in British India about 200 kilograms per year. And you find that it declined drastically to about 150 kilograms, even less, but let's take 150 by the time of independence. With great difficulty in the post-independence period, when we were having not very impressive GDP growth rates, we actually found that per capita food grain availability had been made to climb up to about 180 kilograms by the end of the 1980s. After that, there was a decline and there is some revival, but to this day, the level of 180 kilograms per person annually has simply not been reached. As a matter of fact, the per capita availability of food grains which had been reached at the end of the 1980s has not been reached in any subsequent year since then, and this is something that really comes right up to 2019. Therefore, in terms of the promise of the anti-colonial struggle, while that promise was carried forward to an extent, not very satisfactorily, but at the same time, to an extent it was carried forward, you actually find that the period in which we have a snazzy national revival is a period in which the opposite has happened. In other words, the abandonment of anti-colonial nationalism for neoliberal globalization has actually meant a stagnation or even a decline in the food availability for the people. Now, likewise, you look at the level of inequality. One of the main things about anti-colonial nationalism is that a nation can be built on an inclusive basis only if you have a degree of equality in that nation. As a matter of fact, you find by the work which is done by two French economists, Piketty and Chachal, that the top 1% of the population of the country, which had, in fact, they use income tax data. Income tax was introduced in India in 1922. When you look at the entire post-independence period, you find that there was a steady decline in the share of the top 1% of the population in the total national income, which actually reached as low a figure as 6% in 1982. In other words, in the period in which we did not apparently have very high growth rates, we did not apparently, I mean, those were sometimes considered nowadays as the wasted years, you actually had a sharp decline in inequality measured in terms of the share of the top 1% of the population in national income. It declined to 6%. Since then, precisely in the period in which we have had very high growth rates, and we talk about India's emergence as a superpower and so on, and which is generally a part of the discourse about the emergence of Asia as an economic powerhouse, you find that actually the share of the top 1% has gone up to 22%, the highest ever since 1922, when the income tax was introduced in the country. Those were the days when we had Maharajas and so on. You actually had great inequality, but on the other hand, compared even to that period, the inequality now is actually much greater. That effectively, therefore, you have had a period in which nation building, which is based on accelerating the growth rate of the GDP, has been associated not only with sharply increasing inequality, but as a matter of fact, even an increase in absolute poverty. As a matter of fact, there is a very interesting comparison you can make. The National Sample Survey, which is the biggest statistical survey anywhere in the world, every 5 years does a large sample survey. In 1993-4, which was the first large sample survey after India's turn towards neoliberal globalization, you actually found that the proportion of the population in rural India, which actually had a daily calorie intake of 2,200 or less, was 58%. If you look at the corresponding figure in 2011-12, it was 68%. And you find that when you look at urban areas for which the benchmark calorie intake is 2,100 calories per person per day, the corresponding figures are 57% and 65%. It follows, therefore, that this is a period that actually has seen acute increase in hunger and malnutrition exactly during the time that we have had very high rates of GDP growth. After that, after 2011-12, matters are much worse. They are in fact so much worse that the government itself has decided to withdraw the National Sample Survey's figures that were thrown up in 2017-18. But from such figures as are available, before it was withdrawn, people took a peek at the results and they found that in rural India as a whole, there was a decline in real per capita expenditure, consumption expenditure, which was as large as 9% between 2011-12 and 17-18. Therefore, something very drastic is happening in the country, and this drastic something cannot actually be ignored. And therefore, the kind of markers that Mushir and I and many friends had used years ago in looking at Kuala Lumpur are really markers that are really or can be and are highly misleading. Now, of course, Professor Sugata Bose talked about the possibility of Asian universalism, but Asian universalism is something which would really require, to my mind, as a precondition, an effort on the part of Asian countries to build internally humane societies, humane and inclusive societies. Europe came into its own only when it took a turn towards welfare state in the post-Second World War period. Therefore, if it is going to be an Asian century, then we have to really think in terms of Asia building a humane society. For building a humane society, then we really have to go back to some of the values that had really informed the anti-colonial struggle. Those are values that not only meant inclusiveness, but values, I said, that actually put the people as the raison d'etre for the nation, that an improvement in the conditions of the people is the raison d'etre of a nation. Now, it is perfectly possible, in fact, it's perfectly easy in my view. We have the resources to build a welfare state in India without that much effort. Taxing 7% of our GDP, which can, in my view, be acquired through just 2 taxes imposed on the top 1% of the population. A wealth tax and an inheritance tax would be quite enough to finance the building of a welfare state in our country. Therefore, if we are going to achieve a welfare state, if we are going to realize the vision which was shown to the Indian people at the Karachi Congress in 1931, the vision which underlay anti-colonial nationalism, then we have to have the political will to build a humane society. And I believe that the distinguished lecture which was given today is something which would really come into its own when we show that resolution to build a humane society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. We have been truly enriched this evening with Professor Bose's lecture, Professor Patnaik's comments and observations. It's always a pleasure listening to Professor Patnaik, and it's interesting. And I'm tempted to say that this was an economist's take on a historian's ideas on Asian universalism, and how I wish that if I could add on a political scientist's observations on this lecture, then we could really have a debate on, a discussion on what the 21st century, if it were to be an Asian century, would look like or should look like. So these debates can go on, but thank you all for being here, and we come to the end of the lecture and the observations and comments on the lecture. I can still see 190 present even now at this time. It's 9 o'clock evening. It's 9 o'clock and it's evening in India here, but there's still about 190 who stayed back till the end. That's so heartening and so heartwarming. With Madam Najma, would you like to say anything more or add on something? Or, of course, I'll be giving the vote of thanks, but I still would request Madam Najma to say a few words before I end up the program.
Thank you, Rumki, for giving me this opportunity, although the vote of thanks is totally yours and your responsibility, like all the things. You have done this program with a lot of interest and managed to get the best possible people. Although, and that explains that at this time of people are missing their dinners, but sitting here and seeing what has been a very valuable and a very appropriate evening about remembering Professor Mushirul Hasan in the most appropriate way and giving him the respect that he deserved. And we at Jamia will be very happy to have such discourses more frequently, and not only on Mushirul Hasan lecture next year, but in between also. Now that we have really enjoyed this, this can continue again and again. And I thank Professor Zoya for giving us this opportunity, and also the eminent experts who gave the lecture and took us to another world. It was not, we had almost left, we were not sitting here. So Professor Saugata Bose, it is really I feel very fortunate that I had an opportunity to listen to you. And it was like definitely a dream come true, listening to such an eminent person, and who is giving us so much time. You have given us a lot of time and taken us to another world. Totally, it was unbelievable. And Professor Patnaik, you're as a discussant here, and you took us to another, exposed us to another thinking, which any Indian would have really should keep on thinking on those lines, and particularly if people like you guide us. So thank you for being here and making a right, appropriate closure of this evening. I thank all the members who are there. Professor Asaduddin, you belong to us. All of you belong to us now. But your introduction was very nice and made us see the shades, the sides of a person who is no longer with us, and whom most of us were not really knowing that as a human being how he was. And Professor Rumki Basu, thank you very much for taking this. I gave it to you, the responsibility, and you did it very well. And so before you propose a formal vote of thanks, I just take this opportunity to thank all of you and all the eminent guests who are here, all those who are sitting throughout the time, and who have made this evening so precious and so valuable. It is, you have added value to it along with the lectures and discussions which have come up, but your presence have actually made this more valuable. Thank you very much. Rumki, Professor Rumki?
Yes, Madam. I think she has, Professor Najma, has really given the vote of thanks today, but still, I mean, let me just add that it was such a wonderful evening. It transported us to another world, as Professor Najma aptly said. We are so thankful to all of the panelists who joined in, and of course, the audience who waited for, I mean, this has taken about 2 hours, and I can still see that there are so many who are here. So I'm thankful, Professor Najma, for making it all possible in this centenary year, which is very, very significant that this kind of a lecture or these kind of lectures are heard. And Professor Saugata Bose, of course, has been so gracious, so understanding, and you know, he's so readily agreed to give this lecture. In fact, there was a mild suggestion from my side that you know, he could take up the idea of Asian universalism. I had in mind, of course, the concept of the Asian century that is being talked about so much these days, and what would be India's contribution, perhaps, to this concept and practice of an Asian century. I had merely suggested this to him. I had no idea that he would really take it up as a mega theme and make it the theme of the lecture today. And there are so many things that he said. It's amazing. I mean, we all feel small and humbled, you know, as scholars, when we see somebody who, with his breadth of vision, his comprehensive grasp of history. This was a lecture which, could speak to all of us in different disciplines, in different ways. As I said, Professor Patnaik gave his take on the lecture as an economist. I could give you mine as a political scientist, and I'm sure the Vice Chancellor enjoyed the lecture in a different way, in a different, from her own perspective. This is what great lectures do to us. They speak to us in different ways, with different, and they can be interpreted in so many ways. So I'm thankful to Professor Najma, to Professor Zoya Hassan, to Professor Patnaik, Professor Asaduddin, and of course, Professor Sugata Bose. I think you should be coming to Jamia to speak in the Ansari auditorium to get, as I said, the standing ovation you truly deserve. And students in great numbers should have really heard you today. Which perhaps could not be possible because we are not on campus, and it's so easy to get students to come in when we have face-to-face lectures. So anyway, thank you so much. It was a wonderful evening, and I would like, last but not the least, to thank the audience in Jamia, outside Jamia, in India and abroad, who joined in with us today to hear and listen to this wonderful seminal presentation. Thank you one and all, and thank you so much. Madam Najma would, of course, declare the evening closed. It's her prerogative, not mine, as the Vice Chancellor.
Jay, want to say something?
No, yes, so yeah, anybody who wishes to say something from the panel, again, I don't know if that is possible again, but
this is being watched by many others outside. It's being constantly streaming on the YouTube. So those who are not here, they can see it outside also.
Yes,
And it is
yes.
recorded, so we can use it for many, many times as a recorded lecture, if you permit us, with your permission, of course, and with your editing, with whatever you want. But this can be used for nowadays. It is very important because students are not stand in front of us, but this is the way of reaching out.
Absolutely, madam. I entirely agree. This was live streamed. It was broadcast live on YouTube. That gives access to this lecture to a wider audience, which it truly deserved. So we can now declare the evening closed with Madam Najma's permission.
Okay, I'm very happy that this was started. This was the beginning of appreciating your teachers, appreciating those who have served the institution. I received a number of calls saying, why are you holding this? Why are you having this is not a usual thing. It's the person who has spent his life here, and we have to keep on appreciating them. And I look forward for many other people, similar appreciations to be done by Jamia. Like every good thing, this evening has also come to an end, and I thank all of you and declare this as closed.
Thank you, madam. And let me once again thank the audience, wherever they are located, and have been watching this from the beginning till the end. Let me congratulate all of them, and I'm sure your patience and your patience has been really rewarded, because this was a lecture that truly symbolized everything that we need to hear today in today's time in India. And therefore, the inaugural lecture, the inaugural lecture, Musharraf Hassan Memorial Lecture, the inaugural one, really has set the tone and temper of the others to come in subsequent years. Thank you all. Good evening. Good night to all of you.
Thank you.